Good morning, students. Today, I, Mrs. Anne Mary, is here to tell you a real story about the storm that hit the coastal town of Ersama in Odisha state in the year 1999. A young boy, Prashant, faced the fury of the storm and reached his village. The details of how he worked hard to help the villagers overcome the devastation caused by the storm inspire us to have courage and a positive approach towards life. So let's start. On 27th October 1999, 7 years after his mother's death, Prashant had gone to the block headquarters of Ersama, a small town in coastal Orissa, some 18 kilometers from his village, to spend the day with a friend. In the evening, a dark and menacing storm quickly gathered. Winds beat against the houses with a speed and fury that Prashant had never witnessed before. Heavy and in season rain filled the darkness. Ancient trees were uprooted and crashed to the earth. Screams rent the air as people and houses were swiftly washed away. The angry waters swelled into the friend's house, neck deep. The building was of brick and mortar and was strong enough to survive the devastation of the wind's velocity of 350 km per hour. But the cold terror of the family grew with the crashing of trees that had got uprooted and fallen on their house, sometime in the middle of the night, damaging its roof and walls. Here the word came menacing. It means dangerous and harmful, and fury means extreme strength. In season means unceasing, continuous. Ancient is old. Now, Prashant was a native of a village in the coastal state of Odisha on October 27th, 1999. He was on a visit to a friend in Ersama, which is a small town in Odisha, and a block headquarter in Jagatpur district. Now, his village was at a distance of 18 kilometers from Ersama. He had lost his mother 7 years ago. That day, a strong storm gathered in the evening. Furious wind, accompanied by continuous rain, lashed the place. Now, screams could be heard as trees got uprooted and destroyed the houses as they fell on them. Now, the water flowed with gush and swept away houses that came in its way. There was neck deep water in friend's house. As his house was a pakka house, it was able to resist the strong winds which blew at the speed of 350 kilometers per hour. His friend's family was terrorized because in the middle of the night, trees had fallen on the house, damaging the roof and walls of the building. The crazed destruction wrought by the cyclone and the surge of the ocean continued for the next 36 hours, although wind speeds had reduced somewhat by the next morning. To escape the waters rising in the house, Prashant, as in friends, family had taken refuge on the roof. Prashant will never forget the shock he experienced at his first glimpse of the devastation wrought by the super cyclone in the grey light of the early morning. Now, the storm continued for the next 1.5 hours. Just imagine. Although the wind had slowed down to escape the rising level of water, Prashant, along with his friend and his family, took shelter on the roof of the house. As the day dawned, Prashant saw the destruction caused by the super cyclone. A raging, deadly brown sheet of water covered everything as far as the eye could see. Only fractured cement houses still stood in a few places. Bloated animals' carcasses and human corpses floated in every direction. All round, even huge old trees had fallen. Two coconut trees had fallen on the roof of their house. This was a blessing in disguise because the tender coconut from the trees kept the trapped family from starving in the several days that followed. Now, as far as Prashant could see, he saw a cover of muddy brown water. There was the remains of shattered houses surrounded by the water. Dead bodies of animal and human being floated in the water. Huge trees had fallen and were floating around. Two coconut trees had fallen on the roof of their house. Initially, they thought that the trees had damaged the roof and walls of the house, but later they realized that this proved to be beneficial for them. As they were trapped in the house, they ate the raw coconuts from these trees and saved themselves from dying to starvation. For the next 2 days, Prashant sat huddled with his friend's family in the open on the rooftop. They froze in the cold and unseasoned rain. The rainwater washed away Prashant's tears. The only thought that flashed through his mind was whether his family had survived the fury of the super cyclone. Was he to be bereaved once again? Bereaved means to have lost a family members or a friend to death. Now, here they spent the next 2 days on the rooftop. Everyone was so scared that they sat together in a group. It was very cold and a continuous rain washed away Prashant's tears. He was worried about his family members. Maybe he could have lost another family member and would be in grief over the loss of a loved one once again. This thought worried Prashant. Now, 2 days later, which seemed to Prashant like 2 years, the rain ceased and the rainwater slowly began to recede. Prashant was determined to seek out his family without further delay, but the situation was still dangerous, and his friend's family pleaded with Prashant to stay back a little while longer. But Prashant knew he had to go. Now, the rain stopped. After 2 days, it seemed to Prashant that the 2 days' time was as longer as the duration of 2 years, obviously, for a small children. Now, this shows that it was very difficult for him to pass the time, as the worry about his family's well being worried him. The rain had stopped and the water was receding gradually. Now, although it was dangerous to go out, he did not waste any more time and left to find his family. His friend's family requested even Prashant to stay back, but he left. He equipped himself with a long, sturdy stick and then started on his 18-kilometer expedition back to his village. Through the swollen floods water, it was a journey he would never forget. He constantly had to use his stick to locate the road, to determine whether the water was most shallow. At places it was waist deep and progress was slow. At several point, he lost the road and had to swim. After some distance, he was relieved to find two friends to his uncle who were also returning to their village. Now they decided to move ahead together. Now, with the help of a long stick, Prashant started the 18-kilometer long journey back home. As he passed through the flood water, the journey got inscribed in his mind forever. He had to use the stick to guide him and find the path where the water was shallower. At some places, the water was waist deep and his pace slowed down. At some places, he lost a track of the road and had to swim to save himself from drowning also. Now, after some time, he was relieved as he got the company of two friends who, along with their uncle, were returning to the village. Now, all of them proceeded together. As they waded through the water, the scenes they witnessed grew more and more. Now they had to push away many human bodies, men, women, children, and carcasses of dogs, goats, and cattle that the current swept against them as they moved ahead. In every village that they passed, they could barely see a house standing. Prashant now wept out loud and long. He was sure that his family could not have survived this catastrophe. Catastrophe means a disaster. Now, as the group proceeded, they saw the horrible scenes. Now, they had to push dead bodies of human beings and animals, which were being swept around with the current of the water. As they crossed villages, not even a single house was seen. As Prashant's fear grew, he wept loudly. He was sure that his family members would not have survived the disaster. Now, eventually, Prashant reached the village Kalikuda. His heart went cold where their home once stood. There were only what? Remnants of its roof. Some of their belongings were caught, mangled and twisted in the branches of trees just visible above the dark waters. Young Prashant decided to go to the Red Cross shelter to look for his family. Now, when Prashant reached his village, Kalekoda, he became numb on seeing the remains of his house only. Their belongings were scattered in the water, and something hung on the branches of the trees just above the flood water. He decided to look for his family as the shelter set up by the Red Cross Society. Now, among the first people he saw in the crowd was his maternal grandmother. Weak with hunger, she rushed to him, her hands outstretched, her eyes brimming. It was a miracle. They had long given him up for dead. Now, eyes brimming means here eyes were full of tears. Now, at the Red Cross shelter, he saw his maternal grandmother, and she appeared weak but was glad to see that Prashant was alive. And she rushed to him with her arms open and her eyes full of tears. It was a miracle for her, as the family had thought that Prashant would not have survived the storm. Now, quickly, word spread, and his extended family gathered around him and hugged him tight in relief. Prashant anxiously scanned the motley battered group. His brother and sister, his uncles and aunts, they all seemed to be there. Now, as Prashant's extended family came to know that he had come, they gathered around him and hugged him in relief. They all were so happy on seeing Prashant back. Now, Prashant saw that everyone was worried and injured. He met his siblings, uncles, and aunts. By the next morning, as he took in the desperate situation to the shelter, he decided to get a grip over himself. He sensed a deathly grief settling upon the 2,500 strong crowd in the shelter. 86 lives were lost in the village. At the 96 houses had been washed away. It was their fourth day at the shelter. So far, they had survived on green coconuts. But there were too few to go around such a tumult of people. Now, the next morning, Prashant realized that he had to get over these emotions and take charge of the situation. The huge crowd of around 2,500 people in the shelter was full of sadness as they had lost everything in the storm. Now, 86 people had been killed by the super cyclone. They had been at the shelter for the last 4 days. Now, they had been eating raw coconuts, but now these were insufficient for the large number of people. Prashant, all of 19 years, decided to step in as leader of his village. If no one else did, he organized a group of youths and elder to jointly pressurize the merchant once again to part with his rice. This time, the delegation succeeded and returned triumphantly, wading through the receding waters with food for the entire shelter. No one cared that the rice was already rotting. Branches from fallen trees were gathered to light a reluctant and slow fire, on which to cook the rice. For the first time in 4 days, the survivors at the cyclone shelter were able to fill their bellies. Bellies means stomach. His next task was to organize a team of youth volunteers to clean the shelter of filth, urine, vomit, and floating, and to tend to the wounds and fractures of the many who had been injured. Now, Prashant, who was very young at the age of 19, decided he took initiative to lead the crowd of distraught villagers. He formed a group of villagers, including the elders and the youth even. They planned to force the local merchant to give them the stock of grains and rice to feed the people. Now, on the fifth day, a military helicopter flew over the shelter and dropped some food parcels. It then did not return. The youth task force gathered empty utensils on their stomachs to communicate to the passing helicopters that they were hungry. The message got through, and after that, the helicopter made regular rounds of the shelter, airdropping foods and other basic needs. Now, on the fifth day after the super cyclone, a military helicopter flew over the shelter and dropped food parcels. And it did not return later, but they needed food. So the youth in the crowd gathered empty utensils. The children were made to lie in the sand with the utensils on their stomach to indicate to the passing helicopters that they needed food. Just see how poor condition. The helicopters got the message and returned with food and other necessities for the crowd at the shelter. Now, Prashant found that the large number of children had been orphaned. He brought them together and put up a polythene sheet shelter for them. Women were mobilized to look after them, while the men secured food material for the shelter. Orphan means a child who loses either one or both of his parents to death. A large number of children had been orphaned in the super cyclone, and Prashant put them together under a polythene sheet. Now, the women in the shelter were deployed to look after the children, and the men arranged food for everyone. Now, as the week passed, Prashant was quick to recognize that the women and children were sinking deeper and deeper in their grief. He persuaded the women to start working in the food for work program started by an NGO, and for the children he organized sports event. He himself loved to play cricket, and he organized cricket matches for children. Prashant engaged cricket matches for children. Prashant engaged with other volunteers in helping the widows and children to pick up the broken pieces of their lives. The initial government plan was to set up institution uh, yes for orphans and widows for orphans and widows. However, this step was successfully resisted, as it was felt that in such institution children would grow up without love, and and widows and children without adult care. Now, the sadness of the children and women in the shelter was going with each passing day. Prashant requested Prashant requested to work in the NGO called Food for Work in order to keep the children busy. He organized sports event for them. He took help of other volunteers to help the widows and orphans to return to normal lives. The government had proposed to set up separate institution for widows and orphans, but this proposal was successfully rejected by Prashant. He felt that these separate institutions would neither help the orphan children nor would they be beneficial for the widows even. So these volunteers wanted to settle the orphan children and widows in foster families where they would get love and security. Now it is 6 months after the devastation of the super cyclone. This time Prashant's wounded spirit has healed simply because he had no time to bother about his own pain. His handsome, youthful face is what the widows and orphan children of his village seek out most in their darkest hour of grief. Now, after 6 months of the disaster, Prashant has come out of the grief of losing his mother because he was engrossed in helping others that he forgot his pain. All the widows and orphans looked up to him in their time of grief, and so he learned to come out of his gloom and smile. Now, this was the story of the lesson, and the moral of the story is that the community members should help themselves when the calamity strikes. In order to get the aid, they should not be completely dependent upon the government. Also the important message is what it is conveyed in this lesson, that the youth plays a vital role in his/her contribution to society. Now, I hope you like this story and expecting the same efforts in this pandemic situation. Thank you and have a nice day ahead.